Hello, everyone. Welcome to another talk by Eavestalker. My name is Rémy. I'm part of the Eavestaker community, and I'm joined by Yorick or Torsten. Hello, Yorick.
Hello there.
How you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. Today we're gonna talk about the merge, some of the implications with the merge in relations with the public infrastructure providers. Um, and one of the most popular one is called Infura. So if you've
Correct.
never heard of Infura, it's this huge infrastructure provider by consensus. It's used by MetaMask. It's used by a bunch of other people, but it's like the most popular one. There's a bunch of other ones too, but there's some changes that are coming with the merge, and we'll talk about them that will impact how people, especially stakers, are using these providers in different ways. And we'll talk about all the different ways that goes with that. So let me go ahead and share my screen here just so that people can have a quick look. There we go. All right, so first of all, let's talk about all of these providers. So you can see here there's a few of them. And this is like a popular website that lists some of them. I've used in the past Infura. I've used Alchemy. I don't know, Yorick, if you've used any of the other ones.
I've
Um,
used QuickNote. Haven't used, I think I've used Anchor. Don't think I've used any of the other ones.
yeah, and so like, if you're using one of these providers as a staker, you might need to tweak some of your use, or you might need to do some use changes depending on how you use them. And so we'll talk about the different ways that you could use them and how it impacts your setup, especially for the merge, right? So let's get started. And let's start by talking about the new features or the new changes that are coming with the merge. What are the main ones that stakers should be aware, especially in relations with these providers?
Right. There's really only two big changes that are coming. One is that the connection between what we thought of as the beacon client and the ETH1 client, right? So like your Lighthouse and your Geth, which we're now calling the consensus layer client and execution layer client. This connection changes. It's currently using the standard query RPC API. There you see it. That's the JSON RPC API there. And that works perfectly well to any RPC provider like a Infura, something like it. And all it does really, it asks it, hey, have you seen any deposits to the deposit contract? That's all it does. It's really lightweight. After the merge, this changes to an engine API. And this execution client here, right, that you see here, this no longer knows what the correct chain is. That's the whole point of the merge. It has no idea anymore. It needs a beacon node client to tell it where to go, which means that by the nature of these things, because it doesn't have its own consensus anymore, proof of work is done, proof of stake in the beacon node client is the only thing now that knows what the correct chain is. You can't have, like, say, 100 beacon node clients all talking to one execution client. It doesn't work. You can't have 100 people giving you different direction as to where to go next. So therefore, this needs to be a one-to-one relationship, which means just for technical reasons, public providers cannot offer the engine API.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a few subtle details there, but essentially, like a consensus client will have to drive one execution client.
Correct.
And so the relation here is that the consensus decides what's the head of the chain, and it tells the execution clients to update to this head point, right?
Yep, exactly. That's exactly what it is. That's the whole point of the merge, right? That's what we're trying to do. Get away from two chains, have just one. This is no different. Some people ask, but can I do this? Can I do that? This is really no different from how it is now. I want to stress that. Right now, pre-merge, in your execution client, there is consensus code, proof of work or proof of authority. And it's a one-to-one relationship. Every execution client comes with its own little bit of code that tells it what's next. The only difference now is we've made this more visible. There's a beacon node client that talks to it and does this job. So it's way more visible that there's consensus code, but it hasn't changed. This one-to-one relationship is here now and will be there then.
And so, like, people keep asking us, like, is there ways to do some, like, failovers, or, like, is there ways to have a consensus client drive many execution clients, or, like, the reverse, have any execution client being used for many consensus clients? And there might be some ways to do that. And we might not want to get into too much details for these ones.
Yeah, we'll get a little bit into the weeds if we go there.
But like in theory, you could have like a one-to-many relationship between consensus and execution client, right? You could have like
yes. Yeah, that would work, right? You could have one consensus layer client telling multiple execution client what's next. You will need something in between called a multiplexer. There's not a whole lot of code yet that does that, and it's not been tested terribly well, as you might expect, right? But yes, that's entirely possible. And then also you see down here this validator client talking to a beacon node client. The validator client, you only want one of those because it's got your keys, and if you have multiple, you get slashed. But nothing says the validator client can't talk to multiple beacon node clients. It absolutely can.
Yeah.
Right. So you can have a validator client pointed to two beacon node clients. Each beacon node client has its own execution client behind it, and there's your failover.
That's another way to set up. In theory, there could be another way too, where like you have a single execution client being driven by multiple consensus client, but only one of those consensus client will have to tell what's the correct head position, or like what's the clean head.
I know there's a proof of concept that has that idea that Peter from the guest team wrote, but I don't know that anybody's actually tested that. So for now, let's just say no.
So in theory, there's a bunch of these things that could be done, but like in general, that's gonna be like the typical post-merge setup.
If this was way too much and you're just going to keep it simple, you have an execution client that handles all the transactions, and you need one consensus client for it, and that's it. One-to-one relationship, that's your Ethereum full node.
So what's the other major change that will impact stakers and potentially providers with the merge?
The other major change is that the validator client that you see here talks to the beacon node client and says, give me my loots to this address. That's a fee recipient address. And that's where the priority fees go. So the fees that the users pay, not the issuance from the chain, but the fees that users pay in transactions. And then MEV, maximal extractable value, that will also be paid to the fee recipient. And that's immediately liquid right away. Can be spent anytime.
Yeah. And so if you're using any kind of public infrastructure provider in between all of these relationship or these connections, you might have some issues, and we'll come to those eventually as we go through how the engine API is being used and how the fee recipient address is being used. But ultimately, who decides which fee recipient address is being used for a new block?
Well, that's the interesting part. So the protocol between the validator client and the beacon node client is by design not authenticated, which means there is a message that says, go use this fee recipient. And then there's a separate message in which the validator client goes and says, I've signed this block. So it's entirely possible for someone to hammer a reachable public beacon node client and tell it my fee recipient over and over again, hoping to break through.
Yeah. And so, but like in the end, I believe it's the execution client, right? Who's
It's
gonna
no, it's the validator client. It is the validator client that tells it where the feed recipient goes.
yeah.
Typically the beacon node client has a feed recipient built in that it will use if the validator client doesn't say otherwise. And then the validator client can say, for this particular public key, I want you to use this feed recipient.
Yeah. But I was under the impression that eventually the beacon node client will tell the execution client to use this.
The beacon node client will use this when building blocks. Yes, that's correct. It will tell it that.
And so
we're more concerned about, though, with this connection between validator client and beacon node client.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So maybe we should go through like what are the current scenarios in which people are using Infura or any of these other public infrastructure services with their staking setup, right? So, let's start with the first one. The first one being like using Infura or any of these other services as a way to make this conversation much simpler. We'll just keep calling them Infura because it's going to be easier for us. But like, let's say
not shilling them.
Yeah. Let's say you have your own staking machine and you're using Infura for your full execution endpoint.
And this is actually a pretty common setup. When we did an informal Reddit poll, we were told that about 20% of the people who responded said they're running this way. That doesn't mean that's the actual number because, I mean, Reddit is self-selecting, right? But yes, there is a non-trivial amount of people who run this way for a good reason. The execution client takes a lot of space on disk. Current recommendation is 2 terabyte of space available. And it takes just under 1 terabyte itself, right? And it generates a lot of traffic, which can be an issue for people with data caps. So it's entirely reasonable at this point pre-merge to say, I'm not doing that. All I'm doing is I'm asking it, when have you seen a deposit? That's so lightweight, I don't care to run the full thing.
So if you're in this situation, you might need to take immediate actions here because after the merge you'll need your own execution client, as we mentioned before. A consensus client, like an execution client, has to have like this one-to-one relationship.
We should maybe, this is something we haven't mentioned here, we should maybe say what's the impact to stakers, right? So pre-merge right now, what happens if this JSON RPC API is cut, right, and you don't have your execution client? Well, the answer is not much happens. Your beacon node client will continue testing just fine. It will even continue proposing blocks as long as those blocks don't have deposits in them.
So however, the impact is really minor right now.
The impact is absolutely minor, right? Like POTUS, I'm going to just name check him here, famously was of the opinion that it would be, narrowly rational to just not run one at all. And not even have a connection to anywhere. Just don't worry about it. It's not worth the hassle, right? And he said that like in a year, he hasn't seen a single proposal with deposits in it on his personal validator. They are all over the place in the network, of course. Doesn't mean you will see one, right? So pre-merge, no big deal. Post-merge, completely different story. Now you need this thing for every single attestation, plus, of course, the proposals.
And so post-merge, this setup's not going to work, right? Because the engine API is not going to be offered by Infura.
And they can't, right? They'd have to give you a full execution client, full fat, just for you. And that's not their business model. Their business model is to have a whole farm of these and then load balance and have a whole bunch of people hammering them, right? That makes sense. You want to have some economy of scale here. So they technically cannot offer an engine API because it would have to be a one-to-one relationship.
Absolutely. So what should people in this situation do to prepare for the merge?
They should take this execution client square here and just mouse click drag it over to staking machine like that. Yes.
So that should be your main solutions. Like there's other solution, but this should be your focal point here, because like we said,
That's it.
you'll need an execution client paired with your beacon node or your consensus client.
Right. Just run your own. Just run your own, you know?
There's a few consideration like Yorick mentioned, like disk space is one, bandwidth usage is another one, because the
Yep.
execution client is going to have to talk to this execution peer network, and we can help you with that if you're having issues. Just get in touch with us, but that's the main solution that you should be focusing on, and you can prepare for that. You can start running your own execution client. You can even upgrade your hardware if you need to. There's a bunch of people who are currently like buying a slightly bigger disk, like this 2 terabyte SSD that we've been mentioning before. Should probably be the general recommendation if you're running this on a
Yeah,
single machine.
that's a good solid recommendation. There's a way to get by with a terabyte, but it gets a little tricky. So 2 is a great recommendation.
Yeah. So let's go to the next scenario that people have been using here. So this one here is not much different than your typical setup, but this one uses Infura, the execution layer, as a fallback. And this is a scenario that is also popular with many different people.
Quite popular.
Yeah. And
so maybe we need to talk about, first what's going to happen. Well, you won't have this fallback.
Yeah.
But then let's talk about, well, why did you have the fallback in the first place, and what else might you be able to do? So typically people have this fallback because they need to do maintenance on the execution client. If they're running Geth, which a lot of people are, the thing needs to be pruned, offline pruned, every so often, right? That takes about, on a fast machine, maybe 5 hours. During that time, post-merge, you'd be down because you can't attest at all. And if you get, a proposal during that time, you're really sad. So there are options. One option is to just say, I'm going to choose a client that doesn't need to offline prune. There is work being done by the Geth team to have that be Geth. So that's an option. Gets into, you really don't want to be on a supermajority client. We can have a separate discussion about risks of that and why you might want a minority client. So that's one option. You wait for that. Second option, you choose something like an Aragon, which grows by just a gigabyte per week. So if you have a 2 terabyte disk, it will last, the space will last longer than the hardware will. And then the third option is a client that does online pruning. So Nethermind comes to mind. Nethermind, for example, can be online pruned. Takes a lot of resources as far as CPU and RAM goes, but absolutely works and will online prune itself while it's running.
I believe there's a fourth option too. Maybe you just accept the downtime when you need to do maintenance too.
Sure. So, also absolutely possible. And that is also a question of, how many validators are you running here? What's the risk that you're getting a proposal during that time?
Because when you get a proposal, you get more rewards.
And you get more rewards, you get MEV, you get all that stuff. Yeah. You really don't want to lose out on that, particularly post-merge. You don't want to lose out on that because a lot of your API is going to come from that. Right. When we hear post-merge APY is higher, that's 100% on block proposals, not on attestations.
That's correct, right? So just to pass the message again here, there won't be any engine API offered by Infura. So that scenario is not going to work for you when you need to do maintenance or when your execution client has to go down.
Absolutely.
For this. All right, so let's go to the next one. The next one is someone who has a staking machine with just a validator client using a full consensus endpoint on Infura. I don't know if anyone is using this setup here.
I've heard of people doing that. The effectiveness isn't great, like the effectiveness as measured by Beacon Chain. I recently actually switched somebody who was doing this over to running their own, and effectiveness went from like 75% to 98%, right? So, but if you're doing this, this is tricky to say the least after merge. First, we don't actually know whether Infura will still offer this. On the call today, it sounded like they would, but of course, there's still time until merge. They may change their mind, right? Fee recipient address, exactly, question marks. We should have a link here to Adrian Sutton's blog post about this.
Yeah, we'll include that into the description.
Yeah, exactly. So this comes back to this problem that this beacon node API here, this REST API that's being used, is not authenticated. Anybody can send a fee recipient address for your public key. And of course you will, and then they will, right? So they can just hammer this beacon node client over here in Infura and hope that their message comes through in such a way that it gets honored rather than yours. And then you don't have your fees. That's a real risk here. Of course, they don't know which beacon node client they're hitting with Infura, right? But because this is all load balanced on the back end, there might be 30 of those in there. No problem. They'll just keep spamming Infura with send it to me messages, hoping that one of those lands on the beacon node client that you're on. And if it doesn't, even just a couple do, that's money in the bank. So it's a real worry. At a minimum, I would ask Infura about this. I would say, how are you handling fee recipient address and the risk of these fees getting stolen if I point my validator client to your beacon node client?
There might be also like legal or support concerns or issues with all of this, right?
Well, I mean, I can't talk to Infura's business model, but I would say if this was me, I would not in a million years want to be in a situation where a customer comes to me and says, you caused my fees to be stolen. That doesn't sound like a good time.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like something you'd want to do. But like we don't know exactly what their plan is. We're not in Infura.
We don't.
We haven't been.
They will actually have a
workshop, right?
A workshop. Yeah, they'll have a workshop next week specifically for stakers. So today is what is today's date?
We are July 12.
July 12. Okay. So I think July 19th, they'll have a workshop. So if you see this after, it's old news. But if you see it before, then go poke them a little. Ask them how this will be handled, because it matters.
All right, let's keep going with the next scenario here. This is going to be with someone using Infura as a checkpoint sync source for their data.
Okay.
So this scenario is not going to be anything special,
is?
Right? So it's just going to keep working.
Will work. This will keep working. We should maybe say what is a checkpoint sync, because not everybody knows.
Sure.
So the beacon node client here, if you're syncing it from Genesis, which is now a year and a half plus-ish away from us, it can take days, literally days to synchronize. Or you can get a checkpoint from a trusted source, such as Infura. The beacon node will start from the checkpoint, and then it will backfill. It will still validate the entire chain, but it'll do it while it's already running. It literally takes seconds to synchronize a beacon node this way. And then it still takes days to backfill, but you don't care about that. It just does that, right?
So it's ready. It's mainly
it's ready to do its thing and validate on your behalf, or rather, send that to its other consensus peers right away. So that's a good option to have, and that option remains. Nothing changes here with merge. That's still absolutely doable.
Absolutely. So that ends the different scenarios that people are using these public infrastructure services. Let's quickly talk about Infura's business model here. Like we don't know exactly what Infura is doing, like what their plans are, or like what
right.
they want to do with all of this. But we can read their website. We can see what they're proposing as their offer. And it seems like Infura is not in the business of providing staking services, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, they're at least not so far. Yes.
Yeah.
Infura is a is an RPC provider or a query provider, right? They're mostly used by dApp developers, by MetaMask, as you mentioned, etc. Anybody who needs to query the chain or needs to send transactions to the chain, that's their bread and butter. That's what they do. They do it really well, and they will continue doing it. None of that changes with merge. That all stays exactly the same way it is now.
Exactly. And even if they have this huge underlying infrastructure, it doesn't mean that they want to provide staking services as part of their business model, or that it is easy for them to provide such services from a legal standpoint, or even like from a support standpoint. They might want to avoid providing those services.
Well, right now it's fairly easy for them, right? Because there's little risk.
Yeah.
If you point a validator client at their consensus layer client, the worst that happens is that the performance isn't great, but I mean, they can just say, well, it's a free service. What do you want, right? Post merge, this worry of fees getting stolen puts this in a whole different ballpark.
Absolutely. And so, like, maybe they just don't want to deal with that issue.
That could be. It could be that they just say, we're gonna, they do have filters in place, so not all API methods can be used. That's a standard offering. And so they could just say, we're allowing consensus layer REST API queries, but we're not allowing validator client connections because too much hassle.
Yeah.
We don't know. We'll see what they have to say.
And so, what would be the different alternatives for people who are currently relying maybe a little too much on Infura or any of these other public infrastructure providers?
Yeah, so that gets interesting. Basically, you'd have to find a way to run your validator client yourself, right? Or give your keys to a non-custodial provider. So to run it yourself, you can do it at home. But for some people, that's just not an option because of internet caps and the like. You can stick this into a VPS. You can get a VPS for, I think, under $50 a month that has sufficient performance to run this. Not as cheap as running at home, maybe, but if you needed an internet upgrade, then it might actually be the same cost. So those are really good options there. With home staking, of course, being the gold standard. If you can't do that, you might put it into an affordable VPS. And if that's not an option, then I think, as far as I know, I'm a little reluctant because I'm going to name a name, but as far as I know, the only truly non-custodial service that's still around is block staking. So they actually take your key, or actually they don't take your key. You take your key, use their program, and it creates what's called a remote signer. Think of this like that's almost like a validator client, just even smaller. All it has is the key and it signs duties. And they create this remote signer in your Amazon account. And that's where your key stays and that's where it runs. So it's completely under your control. And then they run the entire rest of the infrastructure, the validator client, the consensus layer client, the execution layer client, but they don't have the key ever. The signing, every other provider that I'm aware of needs your signing key because they kind of do, right? Without a signing key, how do you sign duties? Blocks back in the day had this idea that if we run it in your Amazon account, then people will flock to us. Turns out the kind of person who wants that service is a little freaked out by needing to know how to give someone access to their Amazon account to run a remote signer. We're way too technical already. But,
So there's still a few options.
There's still a few options.
Even if
those are the
you
options.
have like limited resources or technical abilities, there's a few options available to you.
Yeah, and then 2020. When we're talking merge, well, that's this year, right? 2023, sometime we might see. Hopefully this year, right?
Hopefully.
We might see 2023, we might see some options called DVT, distributed validator technology, from maybe one or two providers. And that would allow you to split the key into pieces, and then, you know, node operators run the pieces and come to consensus, threshold signing, and so on. So that's kind of clever. It was in Vitalik's roadmap, I believe, but it's not here. We don't have it for mainnet.
All right, I believe that's all we had to say about this. So if you're relying on these providers and you need help about like what's your next step to prepare for the merge, make sure to get in touch with us. We have some great support on Reddit and on Discord. We can help you with all of these options. We can guide you through setting up your own machine, trying to install your own execution client if you need to. We'll gladly help you with all of this.
That'll be you personally, right?
Probably me or you or like someone we regularly talk on Discord these days, right?
Exactly.
All right, so
All right, thank you.
that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you guys later.